Good.
Oh, there we go.
Yay. Yay.
Hey, Peter. How are
Hey,
you?
Steven. I'm good. Sorry for the lateness is all on me, everybody.
Yeah, don't worry about it,
I'm
man. We know you're out there busy saving us from the bad people out there who are hurting our planet. So we're it's okay to be a few minutes late.
well, good, really good to talk to you as always. Enjoy
Yeah.
our
So
conversations, and it's
listen.
a good idea to stream it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you. So listen, let me sort of I've been talking a little bit, waiting for you, but let me just sort of lay the groundwork for the conversation. Okay. First of all, Peter, a climate scientist, is here in his own capacity. I want to be clear about that. He's a person I greatly admire. He helped to found a group called Scientist Rebellion. It's a model for lots of professions to engage in climate activism. A few days ago, he helped organize and lead a what I think was a global protest at small airports around the world to protest private jet travel, which is one of the most damaging forms of travel in terms of hurting the earth. Actually, all air travel is, but that is particularly damaging. And he has a really great perspective on lots of issues. So I have like three main points I want to cover. We're going to try to do this in 15 minutes. If we go longer, we will. The points are like, I want to get a feel from you where we are in terms of climate right now, like how much time is really left on this earth before like things really accelerate if this transformational change does not happen. I'd like to get your view on the COP27 meeting. And I want you to sort of explain to people what disruptive activism is and why it appears, at least from my point of view, to be maybe the best strategy left to save our planet in the time we have left. So I'm turning it over to you. Tell us,
Okay.
what's your take on the situation now in terms of climate in the world? I mean, obviously everybody knows it's not good, it's bad. There's a crisis. How bad is it in your view?
Yeah, well, before I answer that, I just want to state on the record that I joined Scientist Rebellion after it was founded, but I've been thinking about scientists doing civil disobedience for a few years. And yeah, also like the idea of lawyers rebellion has come up a few times. So we got to make that happen. There's other lawyers out there who feel like you and who kind of want to get more engaged and get more on the front lines. We already have a history of rebellion. There's a Guardians Rebellion, which is like EMTs and other kind of first responders, which is incredible.
Wow.
So yeah, eventually we're kind of just going to merge all into one giant kind of movement where it's just common sense. But right now it makes a lot of sense to leverage within one's kind of profession for various reasons. So yeah, so in terms of where we're at now, it's collapse is a complicated thing. I think it's really weird that as a society and as like universities, academia, professors, it's not like a really major topic. Like there should be a whole discipline called like collapsology, in my opinion, because what we know from the science is that there's things in the Earth system that are changing every day, which driven by the greenhouse gases that we're pumping into the atmosphere, primarily carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels. And these are things like increasing heat on the surface of the planet, increasing water vapor in the atmosphere, which is making storms worse, increasing drought in dry areas, which is leading to just all this moisture coming out of the soil and trees dying and these massive wildfires. Increasing sea level rise as the ice melts all over the planet, right? So you don't have to be a scientist to realize that as the planet heats up, you're going to get melting ice and it's going to increase sea level. So we know how those things are changing on planet Earth. And it's hard to know that stuff. Like it takes satellites, many satellites, lots of scientists doing analyses, lots of modeling on huge supercomputers. So, I mean, lately, we've been able to feel more of this stuff with our own bodies during heat waves and during hurricanes and whatnot. But to kind of project where that's going and to kind of understand and to narrow the uncertainties on what things might be like by mid-century, for example, takes an incredible amount of work. It's not easy. But what's even harder than that is knowing how those changes on planet Earth are going to interact with human society, right? And I think it's like the most nonlinear of nonlinear systems you can possibly imagine, basically. So that makes it extremely hard to predict. I think that the easier things to predict are things like, how drought's going to affect the U.S. kind of Southwest, right?
Hmm.
That's not easy to predict, but that's easier to predict than things like the rise of authoritarian politics and immigrants desperately trying to get away from the equator and towards closer to the poles, where they can actually grow food and live, right? So how we interact as a global society is, in my opinion, very, very difficult to predict. Although we're seeing, I think unfortunately we're starting to see early evidence, if you will, that as climate impacts worsen, the scales might tip more towards authoritarianism and closing of borders.
Can I
Yeah,
just talk about that for a second? I totally agree. There's like a connection, a deep, intimate connection between the climate crisis and the erosion of democracy. You see it in the United States. It is my personal view that it's not an accident. It's directly
I
related.
agree.
The fact the fossil fuel industry, the only way they can keep making the mega profits and keep this business model that's destroying the planet is to undermine democracy, because the majority of the people don't want this. And you see this through voter suppression techniques and all sorts of kind of tactics in the United States electoral system. I have this question though, because I'm not a scientist, but when I look at news accounts of like what look like mass death events, for example, last summer, I think 25,000 people in Europe died from heat waves. Okay. And you see the floods in Pakistan, and you're starting to see like thousands of people at a time are being killed by weather-related events. Are we witnessing like the beginning of the process of the real deterioration because the crisis has not been addressed by governments? Like, is that, these aren't just accidents. These are events that are powerful signals to us
That is absolutely.
we have reached the tipping point. Am I right about that?
Well, you're definitely correct that we've kind of we're entering the foothills of kind of more serious, more intense, and more frequent climate disasters. So when I think about tipping points, I think of like kind of lots of different tipping points in the Earth system, and they're like these like kind of scary things that are looming out in the future. And every day that we burn more fossil fuels, we get closer to them, but we don't know exactly where in the future they are. So these are things like the kind of complete loss of the Amazon rainforest, or the changing of ocean currents on Earth, which could have, the shutting down of basically the overturning circulation in the ocean just south of Greenland in the North Atlantic, right, which would have profound implications on weather globally. So those are two examples of kind of nonlinear tipping points. The loss of the Greenland ice sheet, right, as like the oceans kind of interact with the ice sheet from underneath, and the ice sheet starts to slide dynamically instead of just melting, which is very hard to model. But in terms, I think, no one knows how collapse is going to go if we stay on this pathway. My personal feeling is that it's likely to be very messy, and it's likely to come through inflation, and it's likely to come through warfare, and it's likely to come through like big immigration events, and it's likely to come from the collapse of insurance, which decides or the collapse of reinsurance, which decides that they can't afford to reinsure the insurance companies, which are losing money from all of these floods in Florida, right, or all these fires on the West Coast, or whatever, right, or multiple things at the same time. And then you start to get higher food prices from crop failures. So I think it's going to be a very messy thing. I think we can do a better job understanding how it might unfold, because I don't think we've done very much work at all to try to predict or project how it might unfold. But I don't think we'll ever know for sure. And there's going to be lots and lots of surprises. The heat dome from a couple summers ago was a massive surprise to all of us.
The heat dome, the one in British Columbia and up in Canada. Yeah,
it was a surprise.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's one point of no return here. It's like death by 1,000 cuts on the Earth system, and death by 1,000 cuts to our society. But the big things that scare me the most are just plain stupid heat, just like heat kind of keep going up in like a linear sense, but it starts hitting thresholds of human and kind of societal endurance. And then you start going from 25,000 deaths to 25 million deaths from heat. Right. That's the one thing that scares me. The second thing that scares me is global food supply, which is, hooked into water and hooked into changing agricultural stresses. Mm-hmm. And then the third thing that really scares me is the geopolitics, right? That as these things hammer our society from every direction, that sort of violence and warfare and sort of like the ending of an open society kind of starts to accelerate, right? So I can't say much more than that. One thing I want to make really clear is that I believe there's never a time to stop fighting, that we got to keep fighting no matter how hot it gets. So you also asked where we're at now. We're at about 1.3 degrees Celsius, which is like, I don't know, a little less than 3 degrees Fahrenheit above the 1850 to 1900 mean, which is pretty close to pre-industrial. The Arctic's warming, 3-4 times as fast. Land is warming about twice as fast as the global mean, that 1.3 degrees. And about we're going up in the global mean at about 1/10 of a degree Celsius every 5 years. So that means we're going to get past about 1.5 degrees by like in the early 2030s, about 10 years from now. So that's kind of where we're at. And then we can switch into talking about COP27 and sort of
let me ask you this. Situation's bad. It's inexorably getting worse, and it's going to exponentially really take off soon if nothing is done. So when you look at COP27, and by the way, I just posted an article from Truth Out on my Twitter, which I recommend. It was a really good summation of what happened, and they talked about how the oil companies and the oil producing governments sort of took over COP this year. I noticed Amy Westervelt talked about how a U.S. PR firm, Hill and Knowlton, which works for the fossil fuel industry, was hired by the government of Egypt to do PR for COP. I mean, it sort of shows you where it's at. And so this whole process seems to me to be very co-opted by the forces that are causing the harm. So when you look at COP, like, would you take your precious time and if you could do it without creating any kind of carbon footprint, would you ever go to such a meeting? Do you think they're productive?
I'm not convinced that they're productive yet. I know other kind of more moderate activists and scientists would disagree with me on that, but I think it's so deeply co-opted right now as to basically be a farce. And I don't say that really, but they chose to like accept sponsorship from Coca-Cola. Like, why would they make that decision, right? If not to send a signal that it's kind of BS in a way. And then so one thing that really kind of I thought was just insane in COP26 a year ago was that there were more fossil fuel lobbyists at the meeting than any national delegation. So fossil fuel lobbyists, if they were a nation, they were the biggest presence at COP26. And that increased by over 25% this year for COP27. So there was no effort, despite that horror that if I was like a COP planner, I'd be like, wow, COP26, that was a PR disaster with those fossil fuel lobbyists. Apparently they didn't get the message because it just grew by a huge amount for COP27. So you can't, it's just like the best example you can think of having the foxes, running the hen house. I mean, all right, so global heating, all the stuff we're seeing on the planet, all these disasters driven by global heating, just a pure energy imbalance on planet Earth that's making the planet heat up. And that's 80% driven by the fossil fuel industry and about 15% driven by the animal agriculture industry. So the problem is, like 3/4 of the problem is the fossil fuel industry. We obviously, to solve the problem, you have to end that industry as quickly as you can. And you have a meeting which is all about solving this problem. And it's basically inviting the cause of the problem into the meeting. I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever.
Do you think, I mean, I've always said this, and I've said this in a lot of my interviews, like if I were running the United States, the first thing I would do is appoint a commission to come up with a plan to phase out the fossil fuel industry. Like, I mean, isn't that like a simple thing? It doesn't mean you have to end it overnight, but like what's the plan to actually phase it out and transition to clean energy? I don't know one government in the world that's created such a commission to come up with a plan to phase out the industry. I mean, that would seem to me to be the logical next step. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, and it's not, again, it's not rocket science to come up with that plan. Like, I think common sense tells you what you have to do. You have to end the uses of fossil fuel that are the easiest to end first, and that basically means kind of like taking candy away from the ultra rich, right?
Oh
Taking
yeah.
the away, like, will be a great place to start. And that's why, a week ago or so, we had this, November 10th, we had this global action that was led by Scientist Rebellion targeting private jets, basically, and the ultra rich, right? So part of that was they're like, well, those protests where they threw soup at the paintings, that was super interesting, got a lot of attention.
Yeah.
But it also got a lot of backlash because it was kind of like, what's the target there? So we're like, let's try targeting the ultra rich. I think there's a recent study that said that the average billionaire has about 1 million times the carbon emission as the average person. Yeah, 1 million times.
That's incredible.
People need to realize that
Yeah.
this irreversible damage to our planet and to our collective future is really being driven by the ultra rich, who they want to keep it as quiet as possible. We have to start shouting that from the rooftops, and we have to take their toys away from them at this point. So I don't know what else to say. I mean, we really have to fund the transition away from fossil fuels on the rich and not on the working class, right? Otherwise, right now, like, we've got these high gas prices and we've got the fossil fuel rich making record profits. It's completely unfair. And then what happens? Cost of gas goes up, and you end up getting, the Democrat Party, like, doing everything they can to lower the cost of gas, which means they've basically almost, ceded the climate, the whole climate problem to the fossil fuel industry. And there was a brief a week ago from the White House where they were bragging, just like Obama did after he left office at Rice University, right? They're bragging about record expansion of oil and gas production in the United States during a climate emergency. Like, that's how far away we are from.
It's unbelievable. Yeah, you know what I'm realizing we should do, and we can talk about this offline, but I would love to figure out a way to organize a commission of experts to come up with a plan to phase out the fossil fuel industry in the United States. And if it's not going to happen from government, because it won't, because the fossil fuel industry has spent so much money lobbying and pretty much neutralizing the Democratic Party and owning the Republican Party in our country, it should be done independently of the government. Like, it has to happen.
I'd be down with that, because it's not, again, it's not rocket science. You just look at the different sectors and you look at how hard it is to decarbonize them and what needs to be done. And frankly, people, and this is still a really unpopular thing to say, it is going to include using less energy overall.
Yeah.
Kind of, you alluded to it earlier, Stephen. I've been like kind of I guess an anti-flying activist, you could say, for a very long time, since 2012.
I mean, I know you just moved from California to North Carolina with your family.
Yeah.
Did you drive from California to North Carolina?
We did. Yeah. Yeah, and that was more carbon emissions than I would have liked. But yeah, I haven't been on the plane since 2012, just because it feels really gross to me. And I just, if everyone saw this as an emergency, I think ramping down aviation really quickly would be one of the first things to do. It's low-hanging fruit. Nobody dies if you ramp down aviation. We will be, we won't be able to fly to Paris for a dinner. And people do that. And New York Times is always writing these stories. Oh, like, here's a fun restaurant you can fly to in Italy.
Yeah, they have that feature,
one night.
6 hours in, Budapest or something, and people are like, okay.
But no one's going to die, and then we could start. Aviation's not that old, really, and people would travel and they would do tourism and they'd have a great time before there was all these commercial flights. And then the other thing that would be super easy to ramp down, but also makes me super unpopular to say it, frankly, is animal agriculture. So I said that was about 15%. And it's also driving biodiversity loss on planet Earth, because it takes an incredible amount of land to basically raise food for those animals. It's very inefficient.
So when people ask you, like, what can I do, or the two things people can do that are easiest to do in the control of most people is don't eat meat or fish, I guess, and also don't fly.
In terms of reducing your own emissions, those are probably the two biggest things for most people. Yeah,
Okay.
or at least fly
Now,
less,
let me ask you
eat
a
less
question.
meat.
Yeah.
Out of meat too, beef is by far the worst. So that's
Yeah.
another just first.
That's an important point. A couple of minutes left. Okay. Talk about the role of activism in
Mm-hmm.
on the political side of making sure the necessary changes happen. Now, you are an activist. Most scientists are trained to do research or to do science or to work in buildings and to be in laboratories or to teach. Okay.